I want to welcome everybody to this webinar sponsored by the University of Maryland Extension on options for converting lawn to natural areas. My name is Jonathan Kays. I'm an extension specialist with the University of Maryland Extension. Work a lot with forestry and wildlife related programs. I'll be the only speaker today. Many times we have multiple speakers, but that's the way it's going to be today. We're using a technology called Adobe Connect. For those of you who are not familiar with it, it's basically has a number of pods or windows in there, and you can see the number of attendees, which is now approximately 53. You'll see a video of me, which I'll turn off in a few minutes to reduce the bandwidth needs, as well as a chat box. And the chat box is where we encourage you to ask questions and make comments. And then you'll see the larger window with the PowerPoint that we'll be addressing throughout the presentation. This type of connection does require high-speed connection, but I'm sure most of you know that. All of you have registered for the webinar, and you're now on a list. You'll be sent notification of future webinars. We also have a number of other programs and stuff that we offer through our website at www.naturalresources.umd. And one of those is for a quarterly forest stewardship newsletter, which has a lot of good information on it. And I would encourage you to take a look at that online. What we usually do is put people on that list. It's a listserv, and you can easily remove yourself if you do not want that. And if you do not want that, just let us know. We'll be happy to not put you on that initial one. But there's a lot of good forestry information in there. The program that we're recording right now will be available later. If you have questions, they should be submitted privately to Ellen Green or to the general group out there through the chat box. We'll try and answer questions as we go along. I have a questions window that I'm looking at, so I can get them as they come along. But we also, once I'm done in about 50 minutes or so, we'll take as much time as you'd like at the end to answer questions, and that would basically, again, be through the chat. What you'll see next is our website at www.naturalresources.umd, and a number of different offerings on there. Again, I encourage you to go there. And then about a few days after this this webinar, again, we're offering again this evening. For those of you who might know others, there still are some open spots, and you can register through our website. The recording and other materials that we have will be made available through the website, and everybody will receive an email that they're available. So just look for that in your email box, and that's about that. We have a number of suggested resources today. A lot of what we'll be talking about is based around a program we developed called The Woods in Your Backyard, creating and enhancing natural areas around your home. This is a publication that we use in a lot of our workshops. Unfortunately, it's temporarily out of print. But if you go to where it is sold at nraise.org, as you'll see on the slide there is a low-resolution read-only copy that's available. And we do have a number of copies left here in our office. So at the end of this presentation, you'll see a slide where if you want to order a copy, unfortunately you have to send us a check for $20, and we will mail it to you afterwards. But there are other resources on our website as well related to this program area. The lawn conversion side is only one aspect of the woods in your backyard, but there is a number of other resources online. We also have a 4-minute video that's 4 minutes to a better backyard, and it kind of focuses a lot on what we're focusing today. And you can view that online. You don't have to, or you can download it. And we are preparing a publication, a little fact sheet that kind of focuses on what we're talking about today, and that will be available online with the other materials when we announce the recording. So that's about all for that. Just a kind of housekeeping options right there. Before we get going, I want to find out just a little bit about you all, and we do that by using these polling pods. And what I'm going to do is open each one of these at a time and ask you to respond or indicate the one that represents you most correctly. So first, I'm interested in this topic as and then indicate, and you'll see the results are immediately broadcast. So if you would just take and click the one that applies to you most correctly, And then giving everybody a chance here to respond. And usually once they start to fall off, it seems like, okay, seems like we have just about everybody. And you can see most people here are homeowners, as well as a lot of educators and a lot of people who associate themselves as woodland owners. That's great. Okay, let's try the next question here. What state do you live in? And we can see that a large number of people do come from Maryland. That's good. And a number of people from New York, and I'm sure that comes a lot from the webinar series that New York has developed over the last few years, been a leader in this area, as well as Penn State. So it looks like about 30, almost 40% of the people here are from Maryland. Okay, we're going to take a look at another one here, and that would be, how did you find out about this webinar? If you could indicate the mode that you found out. I think as expected, most people find out about this through email. Oh yeah, most definitely. Okay. Okay, that's great. And a couple of other questions, just two other questions. How many acres of land do you own? And we have some larger landowners, but again, as might be expected, a lot of folks with under 1 acre of land, but a lot of other people throughout the mix. And finally, the last final question I have is this: how much of your land is in lawn at the present time? You know, like a percentage, or gives you a third or a half or whatever. Okay. Thank you very much. And I think at this point we're going to move on to the presentation, and I'll close these polls. And thank you very much for the information you provided. I greatly appreciate it. And we're back to the video here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to freeze this video so that it reduces the need for the bandwidth, and try and put on a decent smile, and then that's what you'll probably look at for the rest of the time. I see a number of people talking about the way the screen is displayed, and I'm not sure. Perhaps Ellen can deal with that if there's an issue with that. Finally, let's move on to the next slide. What we're going to learn today is we're going to talk a little bit about terminology, about forestry basics, assessing your property in the landscape. And then we're going to talk about specific options for converting lawns and intermediate use areas, which I'll describe later, to natural areas. Delayed mowing, using warm season grasses and wildflower meadows, managing natural succession, and tree planting. And then we'll talk mostly about, it's a little bit about tools and equipment considerations, and a lot of the focus of these methods is going to be on the tree planting aspect of it. Okay, terminology, afforestation versus reforestation. When we're converting a lawn into a natural area and putting trees and so on and so forth, that's afforestation. We're taking an area that previously had no trees or natural vegetation on it, which would be a lawn or like an agricultural field, and we're converting it into forest. In contrast to reforestation, where we have a forested area, we remove harvest the trees, and we're reforesting it with other species. But there are trees there, you know, small ones. There's native vegetation, and so on and so forth. And then there's natural versus artificial regeneration. Natural regeneration would be if you abandoned your lawn or a field, and whatever came in is what came in. And sometimes that's good, and sometimes that's bad. Versus artificial regeneration, where we're going to talk a lot about the use of planting tree seedlings. You know, introducing other species in there that would not otherwise be present. And we're going to talk about succession and stand development. And succession in its basic form is just the predictable change from communities from one stage to another, from an old field to a forest as it grows up. So let's talk first about really what we're talking about here is changing the landscape paradigm from one of being a mowed use, which is seen as pretty, as organized, and America in some ways is in love with the lawnmower. And as you can see in this old photo off to the right from a Life magazine from the 50s. But many times it takes a lot of expense and everything else, and there's a lot of other benefits that come from converting a lawn into more natural areas. But it's a paradigm, it's a mindset in many folks. And I think what we're not saying here is that people need to remove all their lawn. That's not the case at all. We're really just talking about beyond the lawn that people need for the things that they need it for, are there other areas that can be transformed? There's a whole other side of the discussion, and that is for another day, is enhancing existing natural areas, and we deal with that with our Woods in Your Backyard manual, but we're not going to deal with it here. So what are some of the benefits of lawn conversion? Some of them are fairly obvious with regards to wildlife habitat and water quality, because you're not getting the runoff that you would from a lawn. Privacy is a big issue. Having trees to separate you from your neighbors, and there's noise and air pollution. And there's this strict financial benefit of, it takes a lot of money to buy lawn tractors, to maintain them, to buy gas for them. And then, of course, there's the time. So these are all benefits that come, if we transform an area into more native vegetation, like this picture. You still see the lawn around the house that's manicured and the beds and so on. But the other area now is going to develop naturally and requires a lot less care and maintenance. Why is this important? People say, I only have an acre of land or 2 acres of land. The fact is that the ownership size of land in Maryland and throughout most of the country is decreasing. This is for woodland as well as open land. Number of owners is increasing. The size of the properties is decreasing. Those arrows don't come out too good. And, many people don't consider they have a forest in their backyard, but they have a woods in their backyard or a natural area. And you can see from this graph that all those pink areas in there are properties that have less than from 1 to 9 acres of woodland. So the point here is that, and this is just for woodland, but, many woodland and ag and open properties are mixed, especially through the central corridor, but in many parts of the state. We have a lot of these small parcel holdings, and this trend has increased dramatically as development has occurred over the last few decades. So the point here is that while you think you're insignificant in the landscape, in fact, you as a small acreage owner are part of the solution. And with neighbors cooperate, that makes a big difference. So all your actions influence water quality, air quality, and all that. Every little bit of effort helps. And so as you see in this photo down the lower left-hand side, this used to be one agricultural field. No more, okay? That's a number of housing units. So the more people can work together, the better for wildlife and the environment, as well as for their personal well-being in terms of having additional time and more money to do other things. The basis of our program that we've developed over the last few years with Pennsylvania and Virginia is this Woods in Your Backyard manual, which is a self-assessment manual that kind of helps you develop a plan for your larger overall property, not just your lawn. We're taking that out here, and it's basically developing a plan, learning about your property, giving you a number of some information, having you go out and do some activities on your property and learn from those activities and pull it into this manual through some various tables and so on, and assess the potential for your property for different projects and make timetables and give you a lot of information. So it's a very good guide, hands-on guide. It's meant to be taken out in the field, and again, you have the opportunity at the end here to order that if you would like. So what do you need to know before consider establishing a natural area? Well, your goals and available resources are real important. What kind of time do you have? Do you have some funds available? What is your goal? Typically, most people don't want to convert all their lawn into natural area, but how do I pick those areas? And your place in the landscape is really important here. Will the natural area expand existing natural areas on your property or those that border it, or create large enough wooded areas or natural areas that can be of benefit? And to do that, we'll have to understand some basic ecological and management principles, as well as learn about a little bit about some of the practical techniques and process of tree planting, and especially. One way to look at it, and we put this in our manual, is this way. It's a conceptual framework of looking at your property. And if you look at these 2 properties, 3-acre properties on the right, you'll notice the one on the left is very much, woodland. That's actually where I live. And rather than, plant all grass seed, we let a lot of it grow back into woods. And the one on the right, my neighbor, is basically all mowed. So you can look at your land use as 3 types of areas. Intensive use areas where you have your buildings and sheds and so on. And then you have these intermediate use areas like lawns and gardens, pastures, so on and so forth. And then you have natural areas, whether they're forested or just old fields or whatever. So the question here is, and this is where Google Earth is an incredible asset to look at where you exist in the landscape. Because you can see the neighboring properties, you can see how things fit together. And the question is, do I have intermediate use areas that I can convert into natural use areas? And again, we'll give you a few principles to guide by. Someone had a question about whether we would talk about meadows. I'll talk a little bit about warm season grasses and wildflower meadows, but not to a large degree. But I will fit that into the context of what we're discussing. From this photo here, you see this little red dot that's on the left-hand parcel. If you're on the ground looking at that, what that looked like initially, while it's very pastoral, there are actually a lot of houses behind there now. But that's what it looked like. We had lawn, and then there's a area growing up in the back, which we had a trail through, and we had to use this herbicide to kill out the invasives as they came in. And 16 years later, this is what we have, as you see on the lower right. So the point here is that as you look at your property, as you look at developing natural areas, remember this is a dynamic process. Those little trees are going to get big, and that's the whole point of that previous photograph, is to show you that try and conceptualize in your mind what that's going to look like as it gets larger. And that's the same problem people have when they plant trees too close to the house. Now, they shouldn't be really closer than 25 foot from the house, because those little trees are going to grow and run up against the foundation. So again, keep this time frame in mind, the long term. Let's talk a little bit about forest succession and some basic principles of forest succession. And this is something that's lost on most people, and which I just mentioned. Natural areas change over time, whether you or not you do anything. So if you stop mowing an area, something's going to happen. Other trees and shrubs and stuff are going to come in, probably some invasive species. Who knows? And the best way to figure that out really is to look at an adjoining property in your area that's been abandoned and see what did come in, and that's going to give you a good idea. So things are going to happen if you abandon mowing. The fact is that you can alter the process of succession, going from old field, as you see in these pictures, to a mature forest on the right. And trees vary in their requirement for sunlight. So a lot of the trees that come in initially are those that love sunlight. They call them shade-intolerant trees. They're intolerant of shade. In contrast to a lot of trees and species that come in later on that they're called shade-tolerant. In other words, they are tolerant to shade. You think of things like beech and hemlock, holly, black gum. There's a number of species. But they can come in an understory or whatever when there's shade. But the first species you're going to get are those that are sun-loving species. And when you talk about tree planting, those are typically the ones that you want to plant as well. A couple other principles. Different successional stages provide different wildlife habitat, aesthetics, and recreation, but especially habitat. And the way we manage wildlife is we manage it through habitat. Are the trees big? Are they small? Is it field? So on and so forth. So each of those different successional stages, going from an old field to a young forest to an older forest, benefit different types of wildlife. And the fact is that with small parcels like many of you have, you're not going to have all those stages perhaps on your property, and that's why looking from a landscape view using something like Google Earth is so beneficial, because you can see kind of the types of habitat that lies around you, and you can maybe create something that's limited in the area. Well, this is just a series of pictures that kind of shows you an old field. This is Virginia, courtesy of Adam Downing, and is an extension agent there. But this was an old agricultural field that was abandoned, and you can see this had hay, it had some grasses coming in, and the process of natural succession, things seeding in. And you'll see that what comes in this area is a lot of red cedar, which is a shade-intolerant species. It needs full sunlight. Some pines and some other things that come in there, cherry. With time, those trees grow bigger, the brush gets taller, things start to close in, and all of a sudden you start getting a lot of hardwoods coming in that weren't there previously. And in this type of an ecosystem, what's going to typically happen is that a lot of these hardwoods are going to come in and overgrow a lot of these pines in many cases. This is characteristic of the Piedmont area of Maryland, from Baltimore west up until Hagerstown area. And with time, a lot of these hardwood trees are actually going to take over the cedars and over many of these pine trees, and you're going to end up with a hardwood forest until you end up with something like this. And the point here is that early forest, when it was very young, may have had, I don't know, 5,000 or 10,000 trees to the acre. But by the time it's all said and done, there's probably only about 150. And that's because the trees are competing, and some are getting the light, they're fighting for light, and others are not getting it, and they're dying out. And that's one reason people ask, well, when I plant trees, why do I plant so many trees so close together? Because you need to get them to grow together and compete together. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. All right. This is one graph or figure I really want you to keep in mind, because it kind of pulls together this relationship between the types of habitat you have, that successional stage that you have there, whether it's young forest, an old field, or a mature forest, or something in between, and that different wildlife species require those different habitats to exist and to be there. So that, for example, I'll pull on my arrow here. If you want, things like, meadowlarks and a lot of your grassland birds and things like that, you need to have, early, old fields like with grasses and things like that. If you want to have something like gray squirrels and turkeys, you got to have mature trees that has a lot of acorns and things that we call mast, okay? Hard mast like acorns, in contrast to soft mast like cherries and other soft fruits that are on trees. But also notice for turkeys, for example, we also have to have this young habitat. So this is for the young poults, the young turkeys that grow up. They need these areas which they can feed on in the spring and find insects and get the protein they need to develop. So my point here is that, remember, the type of habitat that you have is going to support different types of wildlife, and that's an important consideration. So you can actually create these different things as you go through this process of converting lawn into forest. Some cases you want it to go into mature woods, and some cases you may want to keep some of these open areas or young forest areas. One thing to keep in mind as you develop a lawn into natural area, this is where a lot of your very aggressive invasive and natural species, things like grapevine, for example, can really come in and take over. So you really have to be on alert. And I know that we'll talk about herbicides later, but on any extensive area, it's really going to usually take herbicides to deal with these things, but to try and get these invasives early as they come in, and you have a much greater chance of being able to control them. But this is the time when they really are aggressive and outgrow a lot of the natives that may come in. Well, one of the first things you can do in terms of planning for a lawn conversion is to make a map. Now, in our manual, we actually have people hand-drawn a map, and it's amazing how many people can actually hand-draw a map of their property, just from memory. These two are not representative of the same thing. This is just a picture I found that kind of looked a little bit like it, but this is where Google Earth comes in real handy, because actually with Google Earth you can actually blow up your property, you can put on a boundary, and you can use this as your base map and say, well, perhaps there are areas here I need to, I want to put into natural area, like for example, see the green arrow, perhaps the back of my property, and this is where it comes in working with neighbors, because, oh boy, if I could talk to my neighbors into that, they're not using those properties back here either. Maybe they'd be willing to work on a project together to convert this into natural area, and either through tree planting or some other means. So the whole idea of Google and just walking around your property using Google Earth is looking for opportunities. And this is a large lot subdivision. And this particular person on the right, you can see this is a large area. It's up behind a house, and it's very kind of steep, difficult to mow, kind of rocky. And this is a large area, probably about a half an acre, that's going to be turned into natural area, and you can see the tree shelters and so on in there. So that's one possibility. Even a better opportunity in many cases is like you see on the left, is where you have an existing forested area adjacent to it, and you actually pull out and you make a a border area that expands that existing forest area, that has the best benefit for wildlife, and it also provides that diversity of habitat. So you have young area that's going to, of course, develop, and then you have more mature forest as well, and that's really good for wildlife, and of course it reduces the amount of mowing that you have to do. These are a couple other pictures of something similar, but where you're expanding existing forest areas. The picture on the left is you can see that typically most houses are built up on the hills, and that was the case here. This was actually all mowed at one time, and there's a kind of a drainage down here, a creek, and you can see what they did is they maintained their lawn up here because just for their home life and everything. But they used tree shelters and converted a lot of this area down here, and this is going to turn into trees over time. And again, this is another similar area where you have the lawn, but this is going to again be part of an existing, to bring out that existing forested area. One strategy to keep in mind is that a lot of subdivisions that were created on an agricultural field, there's very little vegetation. And when you think about areas to perhaps convert into a natural area, is look at the existing traditional drainage patterns. Where are those low-lying depressions? Those used to drain water. Those used to be drainages. They may not carry water all year, but they're typically moisture. They have richer soils because these areas were farmed, and a lot of that soil used to collect down in these drainages. So you start targeting areas. In this particular case, it may be planting in a lot of these old drainage areas, and you can see that works in well with the design of most developments because, again, most houses are located up on the hills, and then those down areas where their drainage areas can be put in there. Before I move too much further, I'm also going to talk that a lot of what I'm talking today is going to be involved or included in a fact sheet that we're going to make available. We're just finishing up. We didn't have it in time for this session, but it's going to be included with the recording and the other materials once we send it out after the recording is done. So it's kind of taking a lot of the concepts I've talked about here and incorporating them so that you can look forward to that. What are some of the lawn conversion options? This is where I'm just going to quickly talk about the general areas, and then we're going to focus a little bit more on the tree planting aspect of it. But there's two main areas. First is creating a wooded natural area. And we can do that through a number of ways. We can manage natural succession. In other words, let it go. Maybe control the things that come in with mechanically or with herbicides or whatever. But just whatever seed exists, that's what we're going to allow to succeed. The other is where we may have like an old field that's been abandoned a number of years behind our house or something, and the idea is rather than plant that and allow it to grow into trees, either naturally or through planting, we may want to actually remove the trees to stop it from developing. And I'll talk about that. Finally is this tree planting or afforestation, where we're afforesting an existing lawn where there is no longer any tree cover. But you should consider this lawn conversion thing as kind of like a toolbox, as a series of options. So for example, the other option is to have natural areas without tree cover. We do that through occasional mowing or through the special planting of some special ground covers like warm season grasses or even native wildflower areas, wildflower meadows. So I'll move on from here and we'll talk about these. Now in our manual we have a number of case studies, and this is actually one of the project descriptions that was pulled out from one of our case studies. And this is a case where a person wanted to convert an area into trees. You can see right here, a lawn area. And these are the steps that it took to make that happen, using Roundup to kill the turf. And if you get nothing else out of what I'm going to talk about today, if you're going to convert a lawn and you're going to plant trees there, tree seedlings, you have to kill the turf around those trees, because seedlings cannot compete with turf. So and I'll emphasize that more later. But again, this timetable spells out a lot of the details that someone would need to take to consider if they're going to do that conversion. So there's a number of these examples in the manual, and they might be useful as well as some of the costs. So encouraging people to plan a little bit. Well, let's talk first about managing Oldfield succession in young forests. The real downside of this is that you're limited to what is available in the existing seed bank. In other words, what seeds lie dormant in the under the turf, and they are there, or ones that might blow in from adjacent trees, or when the birds and mammals might come in. And in many cases, if you're in a large open area, you're not close to any forest cover, you may not have a really good source of seed. So the idea of tree planting makes a lot more sense there. And if you are up against a woodland area, what are the species that are in there? And which ones do you think are going to come over? If it's all invasive species like tree of heaven, you're going to have a problem. So that's the downside of using natural succession. Of it, you have to control the invasives, but you do have the opportunity to clear around the tree species you want to succeed. And in many cases, if you find a good seedling of a good species, you could put a tree shelter around it, protect it. It's very low cost, but it's going to require a lot of maintenance to carry out well. I did this in my own property with 2 acres, and it's a regular activity that you have to do. Someone mentioned in one of the questions that if chem lawn people had anything to say about it, there would be only grass and no nice weeds or trees or anything. And unfortunately, that's part of that whole landscape paradigm. But there is a lot more pressure, a lot of people interested in natural landscaping. So that is changing, and there are some landscape contractors out there who can be service providers for some of the things that we're talking about. And we're trying to educate and work with some of those folks, but there are some more far-sighted companies. Well, the thing to remember about a succession is that I gave you an example I showed you with red cedar and some pines and things like that. But depending upon where you live, the species that make up that forest succession, and depending upon the seeds that are available and so on, will change. So in Garrett County, an old field is not red cedar; it comes in with hawthorn, and on the eastern shore, in many cases, with sweet gum. So just remember, you need to learn about the types of vegetation in your area, and one of the best ways to do that is to find some forest area that's been abandoned or field area that's been abandoned around where you live and see what is coming in. Another option here, it seems like we're always talking about we have to put trees on everything. Well, in fact, one of the most limiting types of habitat in many areas is old field habitat. And there's this type of habitat, as you see from this picture, where there's a lot of grasses, there's a lot of clumpy grasses, which allows for good mammals and for nesting of birds. And these areas will go to hardwoods or go to forest with time. So one strategy is actually to kill the trees that come into these areas and maintain this unique habitat. And as with all these types of areas that you're going to develop, lay out a trail. That should be your first thing. Not just straight lines, but something that's curving. I have some slides at the end here to show you, but something that curves, it's interesting. It takes you to some interesting places on your property. And maintain and keep them wide enough so that you and your kids and family can walk along there and not have to worry about insects and those types of problems and things like that. When I first started doing some of these woods in your backyard workshops, and I talk about planting an acre of trees, and typically a 10 by 10 spacing, which was 430 trees to the acre, people would eyebrows would go up, because when most people in many small acreage lots, or people would think about converting lawns, think about tree planting, they think about bald and burlap. So, and you're talking about $60, $80 a pop. In contrast, we're talking about using bare root tree seedlings, which cost about 50 cents a piece. There's a state nursery, as there's other native plant nurseries, and can be done. Actually, this afforestation can be done relatively inexpensively. So, and they come typically from the nursery in bags, like you see on the right here. And it's important that they're cared for and kept in a cool condition and planted immediately. And most of the places where you get them, they'll let you know when they're coming, and they can be, so you'll be ready to plant them however they are planted. But you can see they're typically raised about 2 years in a nursery, and then they're removed, and they're pretty much bare root. Well, before we get into talking about tree planting too much, I want to talk about the other options. There are natural areas without tree cover, and that is that maintaining very early successional cover. And this is a picture on the left out of Calvert County, actually, and you can see this is an old field that's been left to go in a large lot subdivision. It's still mowed, you know, very delicately around the house and manicured gardens and so on, but the rest of the, you know, the number of acres is basically allowed the fescue grass to grow up, and they mow it every couple of years or so. And that is an opportunity. That is a possibility. That's one of the tools in the toolbox. On the right, this occurs as well. Some folks who don't want to get into planting and all this is if you have a nearby farmer who is looking for some free hay, just allow them to come in and hay it on a regular basis. Typically, you're going to have to at least have a couple acres, 1 or 2 acres, to make this useful, and there has to be a farmer in the area that's interested in that. But with a lot of the small farms around, some people are interested in this, so that is another option to consider. One wildlife technique that's used in old fields, maintaining old fields, is called strip mowing. And remember, you know, once you stop mowing, after 2 or 3, 4 weeks or so, you're not going to usually be able to mow with a traditional lawn tractor. You're going to have a tractor with a heavy bush hog on the back, and that's something you may have to pay someone to do. And if that's the case, many cases for wildlife will mow in strips. And you can barely see it here, I think, but you can kind of see the difference in the color of the vegetation here. So you mow, like, you have 3 strips, put it in sections of 3, and you mow 1 strip every 3 years. And you kind of just repeat that pattern, you know, whatever the width of the bush hog is. So you have 3 6-foot swaths, and then, you know, you repeat that, but you only mow 1 of those in those 3 different one each year. And you get this diversity of habitat, and you can kind of see that on the bottom here. And this is very good for a lot of wildlife, turkeys, and a lot of birds and things like that. So that's another opportunity. A lot of people are interested in establishing warm season grasses. These are the native grasses that were present here, still are present here, and grow up naturally. These are grasses that grow in the summer, in contrast to cool season fescues, which make up most lawns, that grow in the spring and the fall. That's where their greatest growth occurs. And this is actually a 3-acre homestead you see here that's all planted in warm season grasses. It is consistently going to look like this. So it looks very bushy and unkept. At least when you're moving to trees, that can be that's less of an issue. But people put up with that. In some cases, this can create conflicts. The biggest thing about warm season grasses, and the same thing goes for wildflower meadows, is that part of the site prep for that is you basically have to kill everything. Typically with you know, a disc or a Roundup, and then it has to be disked and feathered out, and then the seed for warm season grasses is put in with a special drill that's mounted on the back of a tractor, and many of these are available locally. But again, this is a very dramatic change in your landscape, and it takes a good 2 to 3 years to establish these grasses. So this is not something for the faint of heart. And the same goes for wildflower meadows. You know, the seed for these things are expensive. They require some mowing afterwards to keep them going, and so on and so forth. But it takes a number of years for them to get established, and the cost can be significant. So that's just something for you to consider. That's all I'm really going to say about those things. And in the fact sheet that will be available, there's a number of good online resources that you can use. Somebody had asked here about, does one not need to mow every year to keep out woody plants and exotics? Does one not need to know? You're going to need to mow probably at least every couple of years. I mean, what's going to happen is that you are going to get some things that come in, some woodies, even after a year or two, and by cutting them back, you know, you'll just keep cutting them back. But there will be some that will be established. But I'm not sure if that answers your question. Doesn't bush hogging kill a lot of ground nesting and ground dwelling animals? Excellent question. It's recommended when you are doing bush hogging and mowing on a regular basis like that, that you avoid mowing between April and August, which is nesting time for a lot of ground nesting birds. And it's a little bit difficult to do sometimes, but that is the recommendation made by most wildlife folks. And as long as you stay out of those time frames, you typically be okay. Well, let's talk about conversion to woodland. I have a more very traditional forestry background, and the whole idea of what we're doing now on small acreage properties is taking things that we've done on more rural forestry properties and bringing it down to a smaller scale, which is why the idea of using tree seedlings is something that that's why we're trying to do that, because it's something that works on a large area basin, and it can work for many folks with small acreages as well. Well, what are some of the reasons for tree planting? We've mentioned a few of these already, water quality and habitat, windbreak, so on and so forth. Reduced mowing is probably one of the greatest reasons as well. Many times hedgerows for privacy. If you're going to create these hedgerows, it's good to keep them at least 50 foot wide, going on a field edge like this or between properties. And the reason for that is that a lot of ground nesting birds and wildlife will nest in those areas, but if they're too narrow, then a lot of your predators like foxes and cats and skunks and so on and so forth can work their ways through that area, work their way through these very narrow areas and be predators on a lot of the nests and so on. So research seems to show at least 50 foot wide seems to reduce those problems considerably. Okay. All right. Move on to the next one. Windbreaks is another possibility. Obviously, there's opportunities there, and that's typically evergreens. I think these are Leyland cypress, which frankly I don't really recommend because they have problems of their own these days. Planning for water quality. You can see in this particular area, this could use some trees along the buffer, and a buffer of at least 35 feet is probably a good way to start. Well, let's talk about the steps for tree planting. First, you need to find and seek financial and technical assistance. We have to do some site prep, selecting the species, planting the trees, protecting the trees, providing access. Make sure you have a trail into there, and controlling vegetation for at least 3 to 5 years. And then at some point, this is the big one for a lot of people, you have to be able to let it go wild. You have to stop. You are mowing to kind of keep things up initially. At some point, you just have to let it go wild, and it's hard for some people to do. Someone asked a question about with the invasion of the emerald ash borer and the longhorn beetle, what tree would like to plant in your woods? The problem there is, of course, the emerald ash borer is mostly just affects ash trees, and in fact, I believe the state nursery now is not has moved away from selling ash primarily for that reason. Unfortunately, it's a species that's under attack, and if you plant it, your expectation is that it's not going to survive. So you could perhaps plant it early on just to maintain some spacing and so on and so forth. But the chances are, as far as we know, that it will be attacked at some point down the road. Well, let's look at site prep. The first step is cutting the grass to a low height. And as I mentioned, if you're going to plant trees in turf, you have to kill the turf around the trees. And usually that's within about 3 feet around the tree. Typically that's done with herbicides. Some people may want a disc or use a plow, but unfortunately that just brings up all kinds of seeds and can cause more problems. So I would suggest staying away from that. And you can see these are in rows right here, and people say, well, that looks ugly, it just looks like a plantation. Think long term, because what's going to happen is these trees are going to compete against each other, but many of them are going to die out. And I can almost guarantee you, given 15, 20 years in many cases, you're going to be hard pressed in some cases to pick out the rows. So as natural attrition takes place or from competition. The other thing you need to be aware of is voles. Voles, we have a fact sheet, and it's referenced in our fact sheet that we're going to send out to you. But we have a number of fact sheets on voles, and voles are little mammals, I'll mention them later, that actually will eat the bark and the roots of seedlings. And many gardeners are familiar with these. But they're usually not found on lawns, but they are found in areas adjacent to lawns, and many times they will move in. So the steps in afforestation, most plantings are done on a 10 by 10 or a 12 by 12 spacing. Not that you can't use random plantings and all that, but it increases your maintenance problems. The proper tree for the proper site. On the left is a black walnut that was planted into a wet depression. Well, black walnuts don't like to have their feet wet, so most of those trees died. So you know, make sure proper selection of species is important, that they're adapted to those types of sites. And when the seedlings come, keep them fresh. Most tree planting around here is done in March or early April. You don't want to wait too much past that because then you start getting warm spells and the trees get stressed and so on and so forth. Someone asked about, well, why not use mulching instead of chemicals? And that's perfectly acceptable. The problem comes if you start looking at planting a couple acres of trees, the amount of mulching that's involved becomes very expensive and very problematic. So again, it's a matter of area and effort and cost. And the chemicals that we're talking about using here are Roundup, really, which is a very benign herbicide. Most people are familiar with it. You know, it becomes inactive as it hits the soil. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. Tree planting methods. Volunteers are great. But there are commercial hand planters out there. There's also mechanical tree planters that can be used. One of the best things for hand planting on a one-on-one basis is a tree planting tool like this. It's a metal bar, and you just make a slot in the turf and put the tree down in there and then make another slot behind it to pack it in. Things like that. Protecting trees. You know, it turns out that actually buying the seedlings is pretty cheap, you know, 50 cents a piece or so. The big cost here is the tree shelters to protect it from the deer, because in most places the deer would just browse these things and just kill them immediately. So these tree shelters cost about $3 or $4 a pop with a wooden oak stake. Fencing can be used, but this is probably one of the biggest costs of tree planting now, is these tree shelters, which also have to be maintained. In many cases, in the early stages, we put these nets around the top of them, and that stops birds from getting down inside, and they can't get out. But at some point, you know, many of the newer shelters can be, will actually have perforations down the side, so they'll split when the tree gets too big. But in many cases, people take the shelters off after a number of years. And while they are expensive, you may want to contact a local forester or even look around, because if you drive around, you'll see these tree shelters all over the place, and many of these plantings have not been successful. And if you approach the landowner, many of them are more than willing to have you take these shelters away, and then you can reuse them. If they're split up the side, they can be reused. That's a real strategy to consider, especially for someone with a small area. Maintaining the tree planting after the trees are planted. Most people will mow for a number of years just to keep things tidy and to be able to gain access and so on and so forth. But again, you need to keep that turf away from the trees, and that does require probably with Roundup, using Roundup, to spray it, you know, a couple times during the season, because many of these trees, the weeds and stuff will come back. But again, if you can use a bush hog, or if you use the lawnmower, you have to do it on a much more regular basis. And the advantage of doing this is that early on is actually this is keeping the grass low is not a good environment for things like voles, so it can reduce some of those problems. Herbicides, again, typically if you're any large extensive planting is going to kind of be required for you know, for early planting. As you can see down here, what we really recommend is using a backpack sprayer. This should probably be a mainstay for anybody getting into this, a 3-gallon sprayer, and it can be used very effectively. You can see this plantation on the right, this planting on the right, while it's been mowed, the vegetation in the rows is not being maintained, and that's not a good thing, especially during the first few years. And again, there's herbicide strips, there's circles, and many people have, you know, put questions about using wood mulch, newspapers, and so on and so forth. Again, these things are very demanding. In some cases, they can actually just create a better environment for things like voles, which will nestle through that and hide under that newspaper in wood chips and mulch and stuff like that. So those are something to consider. Again, just a little bit about weedings, but there's all these things that will come along, and these are things you just have to be aware of in that 3 to 5 year period to allow those trees to have kind of like dirt around them, more or less, not a lot of competition so they can survive. Somebody asked about the longevity of tree shelters. Most of them will last. Tree shelters that I planted in 1990 and are still doing quite well. So again, going into some of these old tree plantings and salvaging some of those shelters is a great strategy. Just basically about voles. Voles tunnel in the ground or on the surface, and this is what they can do. They're very much a problem in environments like this, old pastures and riparian areas around streams and stuff. On lawns, they're going to be less of a problem. But what they will do is they will come in from adjacent areas where there's tall grass or a lot of mulch and things like that. And during the summertime, they're not a problem. They eat green stuff. But in the winter, they'll come in and they get hungry and they eat the bark and eat the roots out, and can be quite a problem. So you want to make sure that you don't have voles present prior to tree planting, and we have some fact sheets on that will be in our reference list on the fact sheet we're going to distribute. But if you use things like this, these are surface tunnels that are seen from voles. This is a little tree seedling on the right, and you can see there's basically no root here. There's a little hole down there, and that vole has come up from underneath and basically eaten everything there is. So the time to control voles is in the fall, typically in September, when there's no more green vegetation and it's easy to bait them and to control them. So again, we have some fact sheets on that. Just be aware that voles can be a real problem. We have some integrated pest methods for voles, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but this is in some of the other materials that we have. Recreation aesthetics. Build in recreation to whatever you're doing. So on the right here, you see a path. Build a nice wide path in here so that you can access the property and not worry about insects and so other things with if you're taking your kids through there. There may be opportunities for a bridge, or put in some little sanctuary areas with a bench where you can go out and read with a book. Put some planning into this, and try and make it interesting. We have some resources on that you'll see right here. That what are the most interesting places even on a small property, and make the trail kind of windy, not straight, stuff like that. I'm just going to talk very briefly about invasives because there's so much press about controlling invasive species. And these are some of the more common ones in lawns. They come in lawns. On the left here is, with the arrow, is Johnson grass. Very common to come in a lot of lawns and old fields. Tree of heaven, or Ailanthus. And then you have a lot of vines, honeysuckle, mile emitted, and then up on the right, multiflora rose. I mean, the list goes on. The point is, how do you deal with this issue of invasives and getting rid of things? And I guess I just have to be honest that in many cases, control can really only be achieved using herbicides as part of an integrated approach. There's a combination of mechanical, chemical, environmental, and biological methods, but herbicides, to really have any extensive effect, really have to be a component of that. And what we recommend to most homeowners and folks looking at lawn conversion is using a known material like Roundup, which is quite effective in many cases. Most people know how to use it. If you're going to buy it as a concentrate. That's typically about 41% glyphosate, which is the active ingredient. And Roundup is just a trade name. There's plenty of generic brands with the same chemical, glyphosate, and it's a relatively cheap material these days, and very safe, extremely safe. So with invasive species, make them a priority, learn what they are, be vigilant, get in there early and treat them. It's going to be an ongoing annual effort, and it's unlikely that you're ever going to get rid of them or get rid of all of them. I mean, that's the reality of things sometimes. And again, the final stage of this is, as trees grow and the crowns grow, at some point you got to let it go wild. All right? You got to stop mowing it. You got to stop being in there. Let nature develop it into a natural forest area. And as long as you have your trail and path mowed through there, then you can go in and enjoy it. Our manual has a page on recording your progress. What I would suggest is you take some camera points, and through the years take camera shots from the exact same location, and then you kind of have a visual record of things that go on. Take pictures. Just a little primer on tools and equipment. You know, many people have chainsaws. That's probably a little unrelated to what we're talking about here, but you know, learn how to use it. Make sure you have a hat. Make sure you have chaps or some leg protection. One really nice instrument for cutting vines is called the brush axe, a Swedish brush axe. And these materials and tools are available from a number of suppliers. Forestry suppliers is one, Ben Meadows, as well as some of the horticultural supply places. So, and those are all online, forestry suppliers, Ben Meadows, and again, there are other horticulture supply, but the first two I mentioned are very common in the forestry area. There's bow saws, and here's a picture of your planting bar. I should mention that many local conservation organizations or your soil conservation district, many of these, the state forestry office, in many cases they have these planting bars, and in many cases it's possible to borrow them to do a tree planting. You'll find these can be very effective, and you can plant a lot of trees in a short period of time, much easier than you can with a shovel, believe me. So something to consider. Just a couple basics on herbicides. There's a lot of herbicides out there. Remember, we're talking about herbicides that kill plants, and the way most of these herbicides work is they're growth regulators. They affect the hormones and the growth regulators. You know, we don't have those types of systems. Now, if you're using insecticides, that's a totally different story, which affect nervous systems. But herbicides are very, very safe, and especially the ones we're talking about are suggesting glyphosate, which is one of the trade names is Roundup. But it only kills what's already emerged from the ground, so be aware of that. There are some others that are out there, but Roundup is probably one of the better ones. You really need a backpack sprayer if you're going to get into this. And most of the spraying is best done in the summer and into the fall when you spray on the foliar leaves or whatever, and it takes it down into the root system. One other strategy for you to consider is that many county weed control departments will come in and do herbicide spraying for landowners for a very reasonable cost. So I suggest that you maybe take a look at that as well. Look up at your county weed department and see what they have to say, and that way you don't have to worry about some of the other issues. There are other ways to apply herbicides, and for the things that we're talking about here, I don't think I'm going to go into this too much. This is explained in some of our other literature, but Roundup is also a good thing for a cut stump application where you actually spray along the top of the stump and around the edge of the stump, and this will stop sprouting in most cases. Or using a little axe and then making cuts about every 3 or 4 inches around the circumference of the tree and spraying in a mixture of 50% Roundup. There is some financial assistance for tree planting. Most of these require at least 5 acres. This will be in some of the fact sheets and the other material I'll give you, but the Department of Natural Resources Forest Service has descriptions of cost share programs that pay a portion of the cost of some of these things and what their requirements are. In terms of service providers, a number of consultant foresters do tree plantings, small tree plantings, and there are a number of landscapers as well that are getting into this area. I guess the most important thing I'll say, and I'm ending here on time actually, is that enjoy the journey. This is an opportunity to get your kids outside. There's a book that came out called Last Child in the Woods, and it brings up this whole concept of nature deficit disorder. Kids aren't going outside anymore. People are afraid of the outdoors, and it really shouldn't be that way. And that's actually my daughter on the left there, but that picture on the right is my backyard, and that was basically just an agricultural field about 18 years ago. So the woods change, it's a dynamic process, enjoy it, and I think you'll get a lot out of it. And that's about what I have right now. I did want to tell you again that there are low resolution copies available of the woods in your backyard from nraise.org. But if you are interested in ordering a copy of the woods in your backyard, we have some copies here. If you send a check payable to the University of Maryland to this address, and I'll just keep this up here right now, to Woods in Your Backyard, care of Pam Thomas, University of Maryland Extension, 18330 Keedysville Road, Keedysville, Maryland, 21756. We will send you a copy, and I think that we have enough copies if for people that would want them. So at this point, I am done. It is about 1 minute after 1, and I've looked at some of the questions that are down here, and I think I've addressed most of them, but somebody asked about the longevity of tree shelters, and that's an interesting issue because when I started with Extension in 1988, when they first started coming out with these things, they said, well, they have some type of photo inhibitor in them, and they'll break down after 5 years. Well, that just doesn't happen. There are a lot of different types of tree shelters on the market. Many of the better ones will actually have a perforation in them so that if you do leave them on the trees, the tree gets too big, they'll actually pop off. In many cases, it is a good idea to leave them on because to get through the stages where the deer might rub up against them and so on and so forth. Somebody asked a question about how do the wildflower mixes that you use to overseed? I'm not sure what that question means. Again, I'm no expert on wildflower meadows. In our fact sheet that we'll be posting are some good online resources, manuals on that, but I do know that wildflower mixes are fairly expensive. It's hard to do large, extensive areas with them. But in most cases, you're going to have to, again, clear the turf off so that you can get down to mineral soil so that you can replant that area. Somebody had a problem about suggestions on how to best deal with neighbors opposed to turning your lawn into a field. Excellent question. I didn't get into this whole issue of ordinances, and I'm going to, but many counties have, weed control ordinances, and that can be a problem in some cases. The one value of using a book like The Woods in Your Backyard is that it kind of helps you set up a plan. You go through a process, you have a plan of what you're doing and how it's going to work. And even with homeowner associations, you can go to them and say, this is what I'm trying to accomplish, and more reasonable people will accept that. And in fact, in one of the case studies in the book, talks about that exact situation where you have a homeowner situation and there was a compromise made that perhaps the trees wouldn't start till 25 feet back from the road. But I won't lie to you to say that there is a lot of changes going on with some of the weed control ordinances these days to allow the grass to be higher than 12 to 18 inches. And most of the changes in weed control ordinances that would make them more friendly to natural landscaping have been to say that you have to have, like, say, a 15-foot buffer around your property. So in other words, you would mow 15 feet around the edges, and then what lies inside of that is what you want to do. That was the case that happened in one county in Washington, in Maryland recently. So, look at some of these issues, and we have some publications on these things to address them. The weed ordinances and how do you work with that neighbor? Again, I think you just have to work with, well, the fact is that some neighbors you're not going to be able to work with. And one of the best ways, again, is to maintain a buffer with that adjoining neighbor that's a problem. And I think that may help avoid the problem. You mentioned earlier about finding out about your webinars. How do you find about webinars from New York or Pennsylvania? I'm a master gardener looking for educational opportunities. If you go to the New York Extension University, it's mostly their forestry extension that's been offering a lot of the webinars, but if you go to Extension in Cornell Cooperative Extension in New York, you will find some stuff on their webinars, as well as if you go to Penn State and Google through their extension organization, you will find some information about those. And I believe usually most of the webinars they have, we advertise their webinars and so on. But once you get on their list, then you'll get an email about when they're available. And if you're having a problem with that, you could email Ellen Green, and she can perhaps help you. Another person, we just have 25 acres heavily wooded but no evergreens. We talked to our forestry guy about planting some, and he suggested white pine and Norway spruce. I'm just wondering if they will be able to grow given the large forest cover. White pine is one of those species that actually can grow in the shade of others. So that is a possibility. It's going to be pretty spindly probably, and if the cover's too heavily, it's not going to probably be able to succeed. But in Norway spruce is another one. Those are two species that are basically what we call shade tolerant, in that they are able to grow up in the shade of other trees. The biggest problem you're going to have, again, is with the deer, because with pine and spruce, once that deer clips off the top bud, there are no other, it pretty much forces it to go to a lateral bud to continue to grow, which is very difficult to do. So that would be the problem. If you're going to underplant those under an existing forest cover, you're going to have to protect them. And there are some tree shelters that are out there that are bigger that can be used for some evergreens, or perhaps you just want to put some type of wire caging or something around to protect them. That's something you need to consider. Let's see. I mentioned a new fact sheet that we're coming out with options. It's the same title as this webinar. And again, that is going to be included with the notification that the recording is online. And it'll have a good reference list with a number of good references, I think, that will help you. Somebody asked if Norway spruce is considered invasive, and no. Invasive, there's been a lot of Norway spruce planted, but it's not an invasive species in that it doesn't compete very well. It's a very slow growing tree. It doesn't tend to put out a lot of seed that establishes itself, so that's not a problem. Someone had asked about Oldfield Succession. Do you require a minimum acreage to be successfully beneficial? I think the easy answer to that is as big as you can make it. Any natural area is going to be a benefit. How large a size? It just depends what it lies next to. I guess I would just have to say the larger the better. And it has to be large enough that actually it can all take place, that you're going to have the dynamics that take place. I mean, maybe half an acre would obviously be a good, probably starting size if you can get that. Another question that I see here, does one not need to mow every year to keep out woody plants? You don't have to mow every year. No, I mean, if you wait too many years ahead of time, those things will establish themselves and they will start to work their way in, but you'll still just continue to cut them back. So it really depends what your goal is, what your objective is, and why you're mowing, and what you expect to get from it. But exotics are always going to come in. Somebody suggests, can you suggest a native evergreen for underplanting? And that's a tough one. What's happening with the hemlock trees is the hemlock woolly adelgid is taking out a lot of native hemlock, which was an evergreen that was found very extensively in a lot of understories. There is nothing really ecologically similar to hemlock that can really fill that void, unfortunately. I mean, certainly some things, white pine is a possibility, but just depends, where you are, and again, you have that deer problem, as you have with all things. And many of your pines, unfortunately, are very intolerant, like loblolly pine and things like that. Virginia pine, they really require full sunlight. They're not going to grow in the shade very well. I'm trying to see if there are any other questions here that I haven't mentioned. I guess I just would say about the whole lawn conversion thing is that one strategy, instead of doing a large area, might be for you to take a section of your lawn and work on that and see, try some different things, or do the process initially one year, and you can find some of the pitfalls. But that's one strategy, or to just go for broke and do it all. Again, when you think about the amount of money, the amount of equipment costs it takes to mow your lawn, the idea here again is not to say you shouldn't have a lawn. It's just to say can I move some of that back? Do I need all that lawn? That's really what we're talking about here. And I guess I would just ask everyone who may still be out there, I wanted to a poll, if I could please, before we're done, to ask you a few questions. And the first thing I want to do is ask you this question here. Rate your knowledge of the webinar subject material prior to participating. If you could fill that in, I would appreciate it. The answer that most indicates, 1 being done and 5 being a lot. Okay, and then rate your knowledge afterwards, with again 1 being very little knowledge and 5 being a lot of knowledge. And of course, what we're curious to know here is, has this workshop or given you increased the level of knowledge of those people that have been participating? And it seems to have done some of that, so that's a good thing. I will ask you this question. As a result of attending this workshop, which of these things do you intend on doing within the next year? Okay, that's great. A lot of people are going to go get some more information, it looks like, and some people are interested in the manual. That's a good thing. And I'm going to close these other polls so they don't become too confusing. Also, in terms of as a result of this workshop here, this thing, do you plan on converting some of your lawn to natural area? And we see that a lot of people are at least giving it some thought, and there's a smaller number that are not sure. I guess it's good to see that nobody says no. Okay, so the next question, maybe obvious question in that sequence is, how much lawn area? If you could just answer that, I'd appreciate it. It seems like, again, most of these are pretty small areas, probably less than less than a half an acre. Okay, and maybe half to a 3/4. And these are things that could easily be done by most people, I think, with a little help from their family, and be quite effective. Okay, one more question here. If you convert lawn area to natural area, how many dollars do you expect to save over in a year? And this is strictly a off-the-cuff question. I mean, I'm just wondering if you have any idea. I mean, this is assuming that you're going to have to invest a little bit to plant the trees, but in terms of lawn maintenance costs and things like that, that's what I'm kind of getting at. Okay, that's great. And finally, I guess actually that was the last question I had. So I appreciate everybody's participation today. We're going to redo this webinar at 7 o'clock tonight. I think there are still some openings if you're interested or know others. And again, if there is anybody that has any questions, I will take them right now. I'll just wait a minute to see if anybody has anything they want to type in. Outside of that, I thank you all for attending, and I look forward to seeing you on future webinars that we may have. And again, I'll go back to the page here that if you're interested in ordering the publication, feel free to do so. And it's coming up. And just to send your check, and then one of these days I guess we'll get in the new age and be able to use credit cards. But again, I want to thank you all very much for participation, and look forward to maybe talking with you again. And somebody had a question, what is the date the fact sheet will be released? It'll be sent out with the notification of the recording and the other resources that we have. I hope that helps. Thank you very much.